For 3,000 years the galaxy lived in peace under the truce of the Galactic King, and in that endless calm people forgot the taste of fear, and believed war was only a myth. The truce was spoken of as if it were a divine shield, a promise, written into the stars themselves, and carried in the songs of children who never once saw the sky torn by fire. Entire generations grew in comfort watching their worlds bloom with cities of light, and oceans unscarred by warships or the thunder of weapons. To many, the thought of battle was as strange as the idea of breathing water or walking in fire. It was something their ancestors had known, but they could not imagine. The Galactic King sat upon his throne of stars, crowned in the memory of ancient wars. He was the one who brought the galaxy to silence long ago, forcing countless empires to lay down arms under a banner of eternal peace. His rule was unquestioned, not out of fear but out of habit, for none could remember a time without his word guiding the balance of life. His eyes, however, never forgot the wars that shaped him. They carried the weight of battlefields that had burned entire suns, and of rulers who once defied him, only to be erased from history. He ruled with patience, like a stone that watches rivers change their path, but deep within him lingered a shadow that even 3,000 years of peace could not banish. For the common people of the galaxy, peace became more than a law. It became a rhythm. It was in the marketplaces where alien voices blended into laughter rather than cries of conflict. It was in the academies where young minds studied the mysteries of the universe rather than strategies of battle. It was in the skies where ships flew to trade and explore instead of conquer and destroy. Humanity flourished in this world of calm, reaching out into the stars, building colonies on distant planets, and weaving themselves into the great fabric of galactic society. They grew strong not through war, but through adaptation, through resilience, and through the determination that had once carried them from Earth into the dark void above. And yet the longer peace endured, the more fragile it became. People began to whisper that perhaps it was too perfect to still. Some leaders feared that the truce was not eternal but only borrowed time. Others dismissed such fears as foolishness, believing the Galactic King would never allow the galaxy to fall into chaos again. But the oldest historians warned in quiet voices that peace so long unbroken was often a seed planted in soil too rich with memory, and sooner or later it would bloom into something darker. In this silence humanity thrived, but never forgot its roots. They had lived through wars before the truce, wars of nations, wars of survival, wars that shaped their very identity. While other species surrendered entirely to the dream of endless calm, humanity carried laughter that was both joy and defiance. They did not laugh because they were careless, but because they had endured much worse than silence could hide. And so the galaxy turned year after year, century after century, never knowing that peace was not a shield but a pause, and that somewhere deep in the heart of the Galactic King the ember of war was still alive, waiting for the breath that would turn it into fire. The Galactic King sat upon his throne of stars high within the crystalline chambers of his palace, suspended above a swirling nebula whose colors painted the walls with fire and shadow. His throne was not merely a seat of power but a monument carved from the bones of worlds conquered before the truce, a reminder to all who gazed upon it that peace had been born not from kindness but from the ruin of resistance. For ages he had appeared unshakable, a figure who embodied eternity itself, yet now, his thoughts churned like storms hidden beneath still waters. Whispers had begun to stir in the dark halls of his palace, where advisors moved carefully and dared not raise their voices. They spoke of decline, not of his body, for the king was preserved by ancient sciences, but of his vision. They feared that the galaxy had grown too complacent, that peace had turned the once proud civilizations into dreamers and poets, unprepared for any true challenge. They believed that the younger generations, who laughed and danced under the endless calm, would crumble if tested by fire. The king listened to these whispers not with dismissal but with growing unease, for his heart still carried the scars of ancient war, and he wondered if peace was truly strength or merely the slow decay of resolve. To the Galactic King the truce had always been a cage forged by his own hand. He had forced it upon the galaxy after rivers of blood had convinced him that no throne could last in a storm of endless war. Yet 3,000 years had passed, and he began to see not safety but weakness spreading across the stars. He looked upon the human colonies that had risen boldly during the truce, and he saw in them something that disturbed him. They thrived, not only in wealth and knowledge, but in resilience. They built machines and cities that rivaled empires older than themselves. They carved homes on barren worlds with determination unmatched by the ancient races. They did not worship his throne, as other species did. They carried themselves with defiant laughter, as though even Under his rule, they answered to no king. The advisors fed this unease, reminding him that humanity was different, that their history was soaked in conflict and survival, and that peace for them was never a surrender, but a training ground. The king heard these words, and he began to fear that the very species he had once considered insignificant could one day rise to challenge the eternal crown for what was eternity. If it was threatened by those who did not fear death in the solitude of his chamber, he gazed into the void of space, and remembered the fires of his youth, when stars were torn apart by weapons, now long forgotten. His heart longed for that clarity, for the thunder of battle where power was absolute and respect was one not given. He believed that peace had stolen this truth from the galaxy, and he resolved that the time had come to reclaim it. The council warned him that to break the truce was to shatter the foundation of every world that trusted in him, but the king no longer cared for trust. He cared only for fear, and the strength that arose from Iton. So the Galactic King rose from his throne, and with a voice older than empires, he summoned his fleets. His decree echoed across the galaxy. The truce was broken. The age of silence was over, and war would return with the fire of stars. The voice of the Galactic King thundered across the void, carried by waves of energy that reached every corner of the known worlds. His decree shattered the calm like glass, and the silence of 3,000 years broke into a storm. He declared the truce undone, and his words cut through the stars like a blade. He promised conquest and spoke of reclaiming the strength that had been stolen by peace. He swore that the galaxy would kneel again, and that those who resisted would burn until their names were erased from memory. Entire civilizations trembled, for they had never known such words, except in ancient archives that spoke of a time when sons had died to satisfy his wrath. Across the empires there was disbelief. Some rulers wept, for they had sworn their loyalty to the truce, as if it were eternal law. Others panicked, sending fleets into desperate formation, though their soldiers had never fought a real battle. Entire species built on generations of comfort now faced the terror of war without understanding its weight. The announcement rippled like fire through the cosmos, shaking governments, councils, and families alike. It was not merely the return of conflict, it was the return of a legend, a nightmare from the past. Walking once more in the present, the king did not hesitate. His vast fleets stirred from slumber. Ships of crystal and gold rose from hidden vaults, and long silent shipyards roared to life. War banners that had not flown in millennia unfurled across the stars. Each vessel was a cathedral of power, bristling with weapons crafted in the age when the king first carved his empire. They moved in flawless formation like an ocean of blades, ready to cut apart any world that dared defy him. The galaxy watched in horror as the greatest armada in history awoke from its slumber. Fear spread faster than light. Colonies sent pleas for guidance. Citizens cried out to their rulers for protection. Soldiers who had never fired a weapon in anger struggled to steady their hands. Every whisper across the stars carried the same question. How could they stand against the king, who had ended every war in the past by force so terrible that peace had been the only answer? Many believed resistance was hopeless, and already began to prepare their surrender. But not all fell to despair, for when the decree reached the blue world of Earth, the reaction was unlike any other. Instead of trembling, the people laughed in cities and colonies across human space. The news was met not with silence or fear, but with mocking voices and bold smiles. They remembered their history of wars that had nearly destroyed them before they reached the stars. They remembered their struggles for survival against hunger, against plagues, against one another. They remembered that they had never been given peace. They had taken it by enduring. The laughter of humanity spread across their worlds like a fire of its own. It was not born from ignorance, it was born from defiance. The Galactic King declared war, but to them it was only another challenge, another tyrant who believed fear was stronger than will. And in that moment the galaxy saw the first crack in the king's new war, for laughter in the face of conquest was something no ancient power could understand. On Earth, the declaration of the Galactic King arrived, not as doom but as theater, and the people who had carried centuries of struggle upon their shoulders answered not with fear but with laughter. Crowds gathered in the plazas of cities that stretched into the skies, and in the corridors of orbital stations laughter rang like thunder. Leaders broadcast the king's words across every channel, but instead of silence, the recordings were mocked with satire and parody. Young voices turned his threats into jokes. Old veterans who had fought in the last wars of humanity shook their heads and smiled as if the announcement was nothing more than a ghost from the past. The laughter was not careless. It was sharp and filled with memory. Humanity remembered 1,000 battles against itself before the truce ever reached them. They remembered nations locked in endless wars where cities had fallen and entire generations had been sacrificed. They remembered times when they had stood on the brink of extinction, yet still endured. Through all of this they had risen to the stars stronger than before. Their history was not peace, but survival, and no ancient king, no matter how powerful, could erase that. In the great halls of government, human leaders gathered, not in panic, but in quiet determination. They spoke of the Galactic King with amusement, noting that his fleets, though vast, had slept for millennia. While humanity had built new machines of war and new forms of defense, they reviewed the hidden projects, forged in silence during the years of peace, weapons designed, not out of paranoia but out of instinct that peace could never last forever. They had prepared not because they sought war, but because they knew one day someone would seek to end the calm, and when that day came, humanity would be ready. Colonies on distant worlds answered with unity their governors, broadcast messages of defiance, promising that no decree from a distant throne would break their spirit. Soldiers trained not with dread but with pride, they laughed as they polished their weapons and ran drills across barren landscapes, for they knew they fought not only for survival but for the right to choose their own destiny. Engineers in hidden stations activated ships that had been waiting in silence, hulking vessels built with iron discipline and powered by reactors that burned with fury, stronger than ancient engines of crystal. The laughter spread until it became more than a sound. It became a weapon, a symbol, a challenge to the Galactic King who ruled through fear. The sight of humans laughing at the greatest declaration of war the galaxy had ever heard shook even the allies of the throne. Other races looked upon humanity with disbelief. How could they mock what had terrified empires older than the stars themselves? Yet within that disbelief came a spark of hope. Perhaps the king was not eternal. Perhaps his crown was not unbreakable. And so while the Galactic King prepared his fleets to march upon the stars, humanity prepared with laughter in their hearts and fire in their hands. They were not a people who trembled before war. They were a people who had walked through fire too many times to bow before it again. And in that defiant laughter, the first true resistance of the new age was born. Humanity remembered the long centuries of peace as a gift but never as a weakness. They had used every moment of calm as an opportunity to grow and to prepare for the storm they believed would eventually come. For while other civilizations surrendered themselves fully to comfort, humanity carried within its bones the memory of hardship. They had been shaped by famine, by plague, by endless conflict with themselves, and by the long struggle to escape the prison of their own planet. These memories were not forgotten but written into their culture, their art, and their spirit. And so when the truce held them in silence, they did not sleep. Instead they built in secret beneath the oceans of Earth. Vast shipyards lay hidden, constructing vessels of iron and steel coated in alloys unknown to the wider galaxy. On the frozen moons of distant colonies, scientists designed engines that could tear through the void faster than light and weapons that could burn holes in the very fabric of space. Their efforts were not broadcast to the stars, they were concealed, hidden within the quiet routines of peace. As markets thrived and families lived without fear deep beneath that calm, humanity forged tools of war not because they wished for battle, but because they knew the day would come when they would need them. Their armies did not march in parades across glittering capitals. Instead, they trained in silence, scattered across barren worlds and empty stations. Soldiers drilled endlessly in environments harsher than any battlefield, preparing themselves for the day when peace would shatter. They were not the ceremonial guards of empires who had forgotten the taste of battle. They were warriors born from history who carried laughter, even in the face of death, for they understood that fear was useless and that courage was the only shield worth carrying in the halls of leadership. Human commanders reviewed strategies that had been refined for generations, plans designed not only for defense but for resilience. Entire networks of colonies had been built to ensure no single world could ever be the heart of humanity. Each outpost was capable of surviving alone, yet connected by a hidden web of alliances and supply routes. They had built themselves not as a fragile empire, but as a vast constellation of strength woven tightly together like the fibers of unbreakable steel. In culture, the preparation had been clear. Stories told to children were not only of peace but of survival, of triumph against impossible odds. Songs sung in quiet homes carried messages of defiance, reminding each generation that though they lived in calm, they were the descendants of survivors. Their laughter was not a denial of danger but a weapon that had carried them through centuries of trial. So when the Galactic King raised his fleets from slumber, Humanity did not scramble in panic, they moved with purpose, activating hidden shipyards, launching vessels that had been waiting in silence ready for this very day. They unveiled technologies the galaxy had never seen before, and their leaders smiled as they watched their people rise to meet the challenge. For while peace had been a gift, humanity had never mistaken it for eternity. They had always known that peace was fragile, and that strength was the only promise that could never be broken. The Galactic King summoned his armies with a wave of his hand, and from the depths of forgotten vaults his fleets emerged like a tide of fire and crystal. The vessels were vast and radiant, crafted in an age when beauty and terror were one. Their hulls glimmered like living jewels, and their engines pulsed with the light of suns bound in chains. Each ship carried banners of conquest etched with symbols that had not been seen for 3,000 years, and as they filled the void they seemed less like machines and more like temples of war, entire civilizations forged into steel and crystal. The king's armada was a storm of gold and shadow, and its return shook the galaxy with awe and dread. The ships moved in silence, but their presence was deafening. Every world watched as the ancient weapons came alive, entire constellations darkened by their numbers, and their formation was flawless. They were relics of an age when no one could resist the will of the crown, and to see them again was to feel the weight of inevitability. To the empires who had grown soft, the sight was crushing. They bowed their heads, believing resistance was futile. They prayed for mercy from a ruler who had never shown it. But across the human colonies a different storm was rising, for while the king's fleets gleamed with the memory of past glory, the fleets of humanity emerged with the strength of relentless innovation from hidden shipyards. Beneath oceans and mountains, ships of iron and fire rose into the void. Their designs were not ornate but purposeful, armored hulls built to endure storms of weapons. Engines forged for speed and adaptability, weapon systems layered with precision and redundancy. They were not temples of fear but tools of survival, and their numbers grew with every hour. The human fleets were not bound to ceremony. Their commanders laughed as they deployed strategies refined across centuries of preparation. They had studied the records of the king's wars preserved in ancient archives, and they had built their fleets not to imitate his style but to dismantle it. Their ships moved with unpredictability like storms, breaking against mountains like hunters striking from shadows. Where the king's vessels marched with rigid discipline, the human vessels darted and shifted with cunning. The galaxy watched as these two armadas approached one another, golden temples of an ancient crown against storms of iron born of survival. The contrast was more than technological, it was philosophical. The king believed in fear and obedience, humanity believed in resilience and defiance. Their laughter echoed even within the chambers of their war councils as they reviewed the coming clash. They joked that the king had slept too long, that he would not understand a people who thrived on struggle rather than ceremony. So, as the two forces gathered on the edge of the stars, the stage was set for a war unlike any the galaxy had ever known. The king stood with the weight of ancient glory behind him. Humanity stood with the fire of survival in their hearts. One side sought submission. The other side answered with laughter, and the promise that no throne could command them again. The first clash came at the edge of a dying star, where the void was thick with the silence of forgotten time. The Galactic King unleashed his armada, and the golden ships surged forward in flawless formation, each one burning with the light of suns. Bound within their cores, their weapons ignited in unison, streams of crystalline fire tearing across space with precision unmatched in the history of war. Entire fleets of lesser civilizations would have crumbled under such fury, yet the humans did not scatter. They answered with a storm of their own. The human ships moved like living shadows, their iron hulls scarred by deliberate design to absorb punishment and adapt to the rhythm of battle. They did not march in perfect lines but wove through the void in shifting patterns like schools of predators, hunting as one. Their weapons sang with thunder, missiles and beams unleashed in unpredictable bursts, overwhelming the rigid tactics of the king's disciplined armada. The soldiers of the throne had expected fear, but instead they faced cunning. Laughter carried through the battle channels of human fleets. Commanders of the king listened in disbelief as human pilots broadcast jokes in the middle of combat, mocking the ancient vessels that once struck terror across galaxies. They laughed at the rigid movements of their foes, comparing them to dancers repeating forgotten steps. They laughed at the threats of the enemy captains who shouted of eternal crowns and endless power for the humans. Each shot fired was accompanied not by solemn silence but by defiant joy. Their laughter spread like fire, reaching even the ears of soldiers who had never faced war in their lives. The king's warriors fought with discipline, but cracks began to show their precision, faltered as confusion spread. They could not understand how an enemy could laugh in the face of annihilation. How could a people mock the destruction raining upon them? How could they carry joy in a battle where suns themselves seemed to tremble? The laughter unsettled them, and in that unease humanity found its advantage. Every burst of defiance sharpened their strikes. Every mocking word cut deeper than any blade. The dying star flared as the battle raged, its light flickering across iron hulls and golden vessels that tore at one another like gods locked in struggle. Human ships darted through the firestorm, unleashing swarms of weapons before vanishing into the void. The king's formations broke under the relentless unpredictability. Entire squadrons collapsed as human fleets split them apart, piece by piece, their discipline once unshakable now shattered in the chaos they could not control. In the throne chamber far from the battlefield, the Galactic King watched with narrowed eyes. His fleets still dwarfed humanity in size, yet he saw something he had never faced before. His soldiers were not breaking from firepower alone, they were breaking from spirit. They were unraveling in the presence of laughter that carried no fear, no hesitation, only defiance. The king clenched his hand upon the throne for the first time in millennia. He felt the weight of uncertainty pressing upon his crown, and still the humans laughed as if war itself was only another trial in their long history, as if even the oldest throne in the galaxy could not bend their will. Slowly, the balance of the war began to shift, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the fleets of the Galactic King faltered. Entire squadrons that once moved like a single blade now staggered under the storm of human strikes, their golden hulls cracked under relentless barrages, their perfect formations shattered by the unpredictable maneuvers of iron ships that fought with instinct rather than ceremony. The void was littered with burning fragments of vessels that had once been called eternal, and the galaxy watched in disbelief across distant worlds. The battle was carried on every broadcast. Screens flickered in marketplaces and homes, showing the impossible sight of the king's armada breaking under the weight of human defiance. Entire civilizations gasped for. They had grown believing that the throne could never be challenged. Yet here were the humans laughing in battle, their voices cutting through static, their ships darting like wolves among sheep. And as the stars themselves trembled under the clash, other races began to feel something they had not known in millennia. Hope. The laughter of humanity spread beyond their fleets, and into the hearts of those who had long bowed to the crown colonies of alien species whispered that if the humans could defy the king, then perhaps they too could rise. Entire empires once paralyzed by fear began to stir with unease. Some leaders debated in secret councils whether to side with the humans or risk being consumed by the wrath of the throne. The very foundation of galactic order wavered, and cracks of rebellion began to show. The Galactic King sat upon his throne and watched the unraveling of his perfect war. His face remained stone, yet his heart burned with fury. He had unleashed fleets older than nations, and still they bled before an enemy that mocked him openly. He could not understand the power of their laughter, for to him war was terror, war was silence, war was submission. But the humans fought, with noise, with joy, with unbreakable spirit. They turned every loss into a rallying cry, every wound into a reason to strike harder. Their courage was infectious, spreading beyond their kind and igniting sparks of defiance across the galaxy. In the void, the battles only grew fiercer. Human commanders unleashed strategies that bent the rules of war, ambushes hidden within asteroid fields, traps sprung from seemingly abandoned stations, waves of drones that confused the precision of the golden armadas. The disciplined soldiers of the king could not keep pace, and for every human vessel destroyed, two more rose to continue the fight. Their resilience seemed endless, and their laughter echoed louder than ever. The galaxy now spoke of humanity, not as newcomers to the stars, but as legends in the making. They were no longer seen as fragile colonists, they were seen as warriors who carried defiance in their blood. The laughter that once unsettled the king's soldiers now became a symbol of rebellion spreading from world to world. A spark had been lit, and no decree of the throne could extinguish it. Then, as the flames of resistance spread, the king realized the truth. His war was no longer only against humanity, it was against an idea that laughed in the face of fear and promised freedom to all who listened. The war that began with the decree of the Galactic King now reached its final stage. The golden fleets that once moved like eternal storms were reduced to scattered fragments drifting helplessly through the void. The iron vessels of humanity pressed forward, relentless and unyielding, their laughter echoing across every battle channel, as if the very sound was a weapon sharper than any blade. The galaxy watched in awe as the legend of the crown that had ruled for 3,000 years cracked. Before their eyes, the Galactic King remained upon his throne, his gaze fixed upon the chaos unraveling across his command. Holograms of broken squadrons flickered before him, and the reports of defeat piled higher than he had ever known. His soldiers, who once fought with perfect discipline, now faltered, their hearts shaken by the strange, unbreakable spirit of the humans. They could not understand how a people could lose ships and lives, yet still fight with joy, still mock death as though it were powerless before them. The king clenched his hand upon the throne, carved from the bones of ancient conquest, and for the first time in his eternal reign, he felt the cold weight of fear. Humanity pushed deeper into the heart of his empire there. Fleets swept aside the remnants of golden armadas, and their leaders spoke not of conquest but of freedom. They told the galaxy that no throne could ever hold the stars forever. They told the galaxy that peace would never again be dictated by fear, but by unity. Their words carried across worlds like fire, igniting revolts in colonies that had long bowed to the crown. Entire species rose alongside humanity, breaking chains they had worn for generations, and laughing as they tore down the banners of the throne. The final battle came above the throne world itself. The skies burned with fire as human fleets clashed with the last guardians of the king. The crystal towers of the capital shook as weapons thundered across the void. The king unleashed every weapon of terror at his command, ancient engines capable of ripping suns apart, yet still humanity advanced. Their ships burned, their soldiers fell, but their laughter never faded. It grew louder, carried by every surviving voice, until even the heart of the throne trembled under its sound. At last, the gates of the palace fell, and the humans entered, not with silence but with defiance. They stood before the throne of the Galactic King, and they did not kneel, they laughed, and their laughter filled the halls carved from centuries of conquest. The king looked upon them, and in their eyes, he saw not fear but the reflection of his own downfall. The throne that had endured millennia shattered, not by weapons alone but by the spirit of a people who refused to bend. So the reign of the Galactic King ended. His empire crumbled, and his name became a memory, whispered only in histories of warning. The laughter of humanity, however, lived on. It spread across the stars as a legend, carried in songs and stories told by every world that had once lived in fear. They said that after 3,000 years of silence, peace was not broken. It was reborn in defiance, and in the laughter of those who refused to surrender to a crown of fear.